Welcome to the Crisis Communication Workshop. We are asking everyone to stay muted during the presentation. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. We will unmute everyone when the presentation ends. Attendees can communicate without interrupting our speaker by clicking on the icons: yes, no, slow down, speed up. These icons are found in the reactions menu in the toolbar. And when selected, they display on the participant's video and in the participants list until dismissed. The workshop is being recorded and the slides from today's workshop will be emailed after the presentation. The Crisis Communication Workshop is presented in partnership between the Northwest Missouri Regional Council of Governments and Northwest Missouri State University's Emergency and Disaster Management Program. This workshop is made possible through a CARES Act recovery grant through the United States Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration. I would like to thank John Carr for his development of this presentation and the material for this afternoon's workshop. John Carr serves as program coordinator and instructor for the Emergency and Disaster Management Program at Northwest Missouri State University. In addition to teaching courses, Carr serves as exercise director for Missouri Hope, the largest full-scale disaster training exercise in the region. The exercise brings together students, faculty, and partner agencies from throughout the country, allowing Northwest students firsthand experience in disaster response operations. Outside of Northwest, Carr serves as the executive director for the Consortium for Humanitarian Service and Education, a nonprofit focused on promoting full immersion, full behavioral simulation exercises to college students in the field of emergency management, nursing, homeland security, and humanitarian relief. Carr also serves his community through his work with the Boy Scouts of America, America Red Cross, and support of emergency management initiatives in Northwest Missouri. Carr has a master's degree in emergency management from North Dakota State University, a bachelor's degree in psychology from Northwest Missouri State University, and is currently pursuing his doctorate from Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. His research interests include citizen engagement in emergency management processes, community emergency response teams, otherwise known as CERT, simulation design, and emergency management in higher education. Thank you again, Dr. Carr, and you may please take over.
Thank you very much, Kim, for the introduction. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to attend this session and to learn more about crisis communications. Tonight is going to be an introductory session covering a lot of the basics. Just to give you an outline of what we're looking at, we'll talk about what crisis communications is specifically, because it's a very, very specific type of communications between your organization and the public. Next, we're going to look at your state of readiness as an agency or organization and how you can boost that. We're going to talk about long-term planning and things you can do to address these risks over the months and years that you have to prepare up some of these processes. We'll talk about some of the specific strategies that have been used in the past, broadly defined, and talk about which ones tend to be more successful than others. And of course, we've got some helpful resources that are going to be coming your way. We're going to be dropping those in through the chat function on here. So you may see a flag come up. Those will also be emailed out after this session gets done. One thing I want to point out before we go on too much further, many of you are probably new to the series of webinars that we're doing this spring, and I want to encourage you to go back and watch some of the stuff that we've covered. We did a session on large event planning, mostly for organizations that are hosting events over the summer and weren't exactly sure what to anticipate. And then, of course, we also did another session on business continuity. Both of those are the introductory material, similar to what we're talking about, but they have some things that are really important to the process of crisis communications. Two of the things that I encourage you to look at would be the Threat, Hazard, Identification, and Risk Assessment, or THIRA, as well as the hindcasting discussion. We'll reference those as we go through, but I'm not going to go over them in as great a detail just because we got some other stuff to cover tonight. Also, again, this is introductory material. This is something that that people do as a full-time career in larger organizations, so we don't really have sufficient time to cover every single topic in the span. However, I wanted to make sure that this is offering up the basic material that you need to get started, as well as pointing out where else you can go to pursue further training opportunities within this topic. The three places that I probably recommend that you start with, one would be the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency. It's very possible that many of you have participated in a training from them before, but as citizens, as representatives of local government, et cetera, those trainings are free for you to attend, and you can find that on the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency's website. You can take public information officer courses as well as other things that are related to this topic. I really recommend that you go and take some of those trainings. At a national level, FEMA offers a lot of trainings that are in this vein as well, and that is through their Emergency Management Institute. FEMA actually has a campus that they have purchased just north of Washington, D.C. And for many of these trainings, you are able to get flown out by FEMA, head up and attend this training. And the vast majority of your expenses are covered under that training budget that FEMA has. So, that may change a little bit year to year. So I encourage you, since the session is being recorded, if you're watching this after this presentation gets done, things may have changed a little bit, but please seek out the Emergency Management Institute and learn a little bit about what they do and find out what trainings they're offering that may be relevant to your organization. Lastly, I'll also reference some of the CDC guidance. We have a number of healthcare facilities that are on the call tonight. And so I would encourage you to look for the CDC templates and other guides that they offer because they are a great starting place that's going to get you much closer to what your specific task is related to crisis communications within healthcare facilities. For everybody else that is outside of that, those documents are also going to be relevant. You just may have to have some minor adjustments to that. So let's get to talking about what crisis communications is. The definition that we tend to work with is a crisis is an event that negatively affects the organization's reputation, potentially including other negative impacts to the organization, patrons, and community. This could be something like the misbehavior of an employee or a volunteer within your organization. It could be malpractice of the organization that you're having to address. It could be accidents leading to injury, damage to property, or other cases such as loss of life. It's a pretty broad definition, but a lot of it has to do with you managing both the incident as well as the reputation of your organization at the same time. So why does this matter to most of our organizations? Regardless of what type of group you work for or are attending on behalf of tonight, what we recognize is that 25% of an organization's value comes from their reputation alone. Just as a case study that I typically use with my students here at the university, in one day, Snapchat lost 6% of their stock after a celebrity tweeted about not using the app. They lost over $1 billion in a matter of a day because they had one individual say, I don't use this service anymore. And that was enough to take their stock down by 6%. Now, of course, it may not be that a celebrity is necessarily endorsing Northwest Missouri businesses or hospitals or anything like that. But we can all recognize the potential for a rumor going around in our communities or negative traction on social media outlets and how those things may affect our business or our reputation or the clientele that we serve. Those are the things that are more relevant to us. What we want to do is recognize what exactly this risk is, and then talk a little bit about ways that we can potentially manage it. So what does crisis communications look like? Depending on what era of television you watch, it may be that they're showing everything with news conferences with cameras, lights, everything else. Typically, though, for most of our organizations, it's going to look like social media posts as well as emails to patrons and some of that local level type of communications. If an event grows bigger or it's something that we're wanting to reach a wider audience, it could be that we start to do interviews with media, meaning our local newspapers, local radio stations, et cetera. But anymore, it's pretty rare that we actually see a proper press conference unless it's a government entity that's monitoring behavior, or if it is the potential for a pretty sizable organization to do something like a donor announcement or an infrastructure update. But again, if we're looking at crisis communications, even the big organizations are largely leveraging those first two options of social media posts and emails to manage the day-to-day operations. So let's talk about the state of readiness and some of the things that go into that. So some things that we can look at with our state of readiness might include our THIRA and risk assessment, which we'll talk about, looking at how we manage potential incidents through hindcasting. Monitoring is one that is a really critical process, as well as, of course, the long-term planning for crisis communications. Whenever we look at our threat and hazard identification, again, I'd encourage you to go back to that previous session because we'll talk about it in much greater detail. But what we see is that our goal as an organization is to understand what things can harm us and how likely those things are to happen. Whenever we look at the hazard identification, it's exactly that. What is out there that can harm us? And a little bit of a description of what that thing is. I need to understand that negative media attention through social media, somebody, if it's a restaurant, somebody finding a hair in their food and posting on it, or a negative review on some review site. That is the hazard that we're identifying, and then we add context to that as to why it's relevant. Well, negative press makes more negative press on social media, and that's why we need to track on that early. Whenever we look at the risk assessment, what we're looking at is how bad it can harm us and how likely it is to happen. So if it is something that is a sizable event, such as a tornado hitting whatever business we work at, that's going to have a high impact and a moderate to low likelihood, depending on the size of our business and the region that we're located in. Other things that I would encourage you to look up would be the risk assessment tool. It's pretty self-explanatory working with that, but again, go back and check out our description of that there. Next up is looking at hindcasting. Hindcasting is the idea of us having a fictional news story and then having our team of experts at our organization work through what might have happened to cause that incident. So if we have a hazard event that we've recognized, so let's say that it's malpractice of our organization or an individual within our organization, which is more likely. Somebody that works for us has done something potentially harmful, and now we have to address it. You put that narrative in front of your team and then backtrack and say, what could have caused this? What could have stopped this? How can we adjust our existing operations to avoid the potential of this in the future? And at its most simplistic level, this is hindcasting. There's a lot more elaborate steps to it, but that's the general process. That's one that we talked about in our large event planning workshop, that we talked a little about our decision-making model and how exactly we can plan for that this summer. For our organizations, this is a really helpful tool because it allows us to put ourselves in different shoes. A lot of times we get complacent and we let ourselves believe that bad thing will not happen. However, we rarely make it past that step to look at what things exist that may cause that to happen. And it's that gap in the middle where we say, oh, we'd like to think that this thing won't happen, but we do have these conditions that should still be of concern to us. Hindcasting is able to identify what those are and to make it to where they're out in the open for the team to discuss and identify. It also allows your team as a collective to talk through what their views are on that specific topic. For me as a chief operations officer, I see this. Well, for me in public relations, I see this. For a maintenance team at the facility, you guys have that part, but you have no idea what the infrastructure looks like. Here's what I'm seeing on my end. It's a nice thing to get everybody around that table and discuss that topic and have that holistic view of what all goes into that, because very rarely is it just one little linchpin that is leading to that. A lot of times, again, we covered it in other sessions, but it's kind of like slices of Swiss cheese with holes in the middle. When those holes line up, that's when something bad can happen. And so it's not just one hole, it's all of those different holes in the Swiss cheese that lead to that event happening. So let's get to talking about some of the other things that are specific to this session. One of the first ones that I would guess many of your organizations are doing is looking at monitoring. If you want to see a really great example of this, while I am biased since they are my employer, Northwest does an exceptional job of doing social media monitoring and engaging with the public. This is something on not just the university, but our university police department specifically. Anytime you're thinking that there might be a snow day for public schools, I encourage you to look at what the university is doing that day. University police, as well as some of their other officials that are working in that agency, track what's going on with students. They engage with students. They make sure that they know what's going to happen the next day. And they quell any rumors that if one student says, I heard from so-and-so that they're canceling, there's that engagement where university police can correct information or make sure that everybody is aware of the accurate information as part of that. This is a day-to-day operation that most of your organizations probably are already engaging in, but it really has to do with watching for some of those key phrases, key hashtags, tags of your organization's account, and seeing how exactly you're being viewed in the public. The more that you track on that information, the more that you recognize where that discussion is heading, the more informed your team is going to be as it relates to communicating. We need to be aware of how we might be perceived if we were to roll this out with no other announcement. Or, we know that individuals are concerned about XYZ topic. We need to be sensitive about that whenever we release information. This monitoring is that first step and is really helpful just regardless of crisis communication, but it's helpful in the health of your organization to understand what that public perception is. So now let's talk about planning and some of the things that we can do on a broader level for crisis communications. So we talked about the start of our day-to-day operations. We'll also talk a little bit about what to do when the situation grows beyond a day-to-day event, the trigger events that we can put in place, as well as what a scaled approach to crisis communications might be like for our organization. So again, some things you can do is focus on monitoring, as well as look at possibly liking posts, commenting, addressing critical posts that may be identifying gaps in your organization's responses. That shows those individuals that you are watching, that you are trying to be responsive to some of the needs that they're identifying, and it shows that you are actually doing something. One thing that organizations a lot of times get critiqued on pretty hard is simply lack of action. They know that there's an event happening, and even though the wheels might be turning internally, everybody outside is waiting for a response. And if one does not come, the individuals are going to make a story out of the lack of everything versus whatever the organization is offering up. So those day-to-day operations are really critical as you're starting to spin up into some of the events that may require further attention on your organization's part. So now looking at the beyond the day-to-day. Some examples that we might be looking at might be a negative post that spikes beyond normal activity. Going viral for some of these posts, it's really interesting to see how some things can take all kinds of activity right off the bat for a post that otherwise would not be that spectacular. For those of you that are unfamiliar with social media, go ahead and check out the trending section of any given social media platform, and you'll probably see some sort of PR nightmare that's happening right now. I'm not going to date this presentation since it's being recorded, but I can guarantee you that right now, whatever date you're looking at it, if you go to that trending page, there's probably something that's happening, regardless of when you're watching the video. Other things might be a negative post from someone with a significant number of followers, again, looking at the potential for a celebrity to reduce stock in a company by simply saying they're not using it anymore, or a sizable amount of claims that warrant investigation. So we've got a number of individuals coming forward saying, I had this negative experience and I want you to take notice of it. All of these things have the potential to impact our organization regardless of its size. So those are some things that we use to start off with. One thing that we want to look at with our planning is the idea of setting triggers. One challenge many organizations have is events happen so rarely that we are hesitant to begin our response because we keep thinking maybe this is going to get better right away. Maybe this is going to improve in the next few hours. Maybe this is going to improve in the next couple of days. And we want to avoid sitting on our hands hoping that something is going to change. Hope is neither a strategy nor a course of action. So with this, one thing that I'd encourage you to do is with your plans, once we've identified what the potential hazards are, as you're looking at your response plan, identify what your trigger is going to be to start that response plan. So these are going to be if-then statements that ensure that the organization takes action when it's appropriate. And it also takes the guesswork out of it. We know that when X happens, Y is going to be our response. So some examples. If we see a claim about a critical topic, such as poor behavior on one of our employees' parts, then we will take the following action. Or more specifically, if we see a tweet about poor performance at one of our locations, then we will comment with a link to contact our information page. If we see a social media post that spikes for negative reasons, then we will begin our incident response processes and move on to the next phase. These are things that should probably start off your response plans to say, this is when this thing starts. This is when we will kick off the following actions. And again, that takes the guesswork out of it. And that also makes it easier if it is not the head individual of the organization that's making that call. Sometimes we get nervous that we're going to be the one to throw the flag too quickly, and we hesitate. And if it's somebody that is lower down in the organization, somebody that is just PR, or somebody that is monitoring social media as part of their duties, that makes it easier on them to know when exactly they're supposed to start those processes. The next thing is looking at a scaled response. If you look at how some of this engagement occurs on social media, what we see is that it's typically not an immediate spike. It has somewhat of an uptick and downturn. Of course, there's some rare exceptions to that when something just kicks off at a moment's notice. For our organizations, what we want to do is address it in similar fashion, where we start with a scaled response where we know what's happening at level 1, then we bump up to level 2, and then we bump up to level 3. As an example of this, I've provided a couple of samples. So looking at our level 1 for an organization, we see that there's high activity on a negative post that is about our organization. Well, with that level, what we're going to do is we're going to further monitor and assign that to an individual for 48 hours. We're going to have that person just watch social media around the clock and see what else is happening. And then just in case, we're going to let our C-suite or our chief operating officer, chief executive officer, whoever those individuals are, we're going to tell them to be on call 24/7 just in case things get worse. If things do get worse, then we've got our opportunity to bump up to level 2. This means that now we're looking at activity on the negative post spikes beyond normal traffic. So now we're seeing thousands of likes or thousands of retweets or whatever that might be, depending on the platform. And now we know that we need to take further action than just watching what's going on. Now we're going to bump up our response to posting on the organization's social media accounts by the CEO, and then consult our PR team as far as what else we need to be doing. If things get worse than that, then we bump it up to what will probably be the top level for many organizations. And that is, a post gains negative media coverage from local or regional outlets. Something has happened to warrant that, the Kansas City News Press, Omaha, Des Moines, some of those may pay attention to what's going on with our organization. And now we really need all hands on deck. So we've got our CEO and our C-suite team ready to go. And we discuss the potential for further action beyond that. Does this need to be something where we're starting an investigation? Does this need to be something where we are looking into our behavior of that individual that was associated with these events? But of course, we leave that a little bit open to say we know that we can't predict all the million things that could possibly go wrong in the world. But this is the general response that we have just in case there's something of this nature. All right, other important considerations for your plan. One thing is looking at the size and specialization of your staff. For many of you, you may be wearing 6 or 7 different hats in a relatively small organization. And believe me, I understand how that operates. And so one of the goals of this presentation is to give you things you can use regardless of size and scale of your organization. Next thing that we're looking at is the social media presence of your organization. For some of you, you may be highly reliant on that social media presence. Maybe you've got an organization that is focused on sales or community engagement. You're wanting to make sure that you've got a positive presence on social media. That way you can recruit more business. However, there's other businesses that may not need that same degree of social media presence. I think for a lot of our rural communities, individuals in the service industry of construction, et cetera, there's no shortage of business. So maybe that type of organization doesn't have that. These are things that are certainly something to consider as you're looking at what exactly we need to have ready. The next one is, what will our insurance plan cover? And I say this because a lot of times with your business insurance, you have the possibility that there are further responses that your insurance plan will cover, but you need to make sure that those boxes are ticked or that you have that type of service included. These might be things where if we have a negative event at a large enough organization, sometimes their insurance policy will cover a team of individuals coming in and guiding the response. Because frankly, if something's happening to the organization, it may very well be happening to the people that are typically responsible for making those decisions. If I'm in charge of a hospital, for example, and there's an active shooter event at the hospital, if I'm the PR person, I'm going to be traumatized. If I'm the CEO, I may be traumatized. So those individuals probably need a break in that moment, which is why business insurance sometimes does include that type of response. I'd encourage you to reach out to your insurance provider and just ask, is this something that's included? Is this something that's a possibility that we could receive? What are the terms of that? What are the specific services that are included, et cetera, just to see what else is out there. It is still critical that you have internal capabilities for some of these things, because you don't want to be waiting on an event to get big enough that your insurance is going to come in. So we want to make sure we're responding to that. If you are part of a regional or national organization, what does their support include? One of my side hobbies is working with youth camps and identifying how we can make those safer for the campers. One thing that is a huge benefit is that depending on the organization, there are multiple national organizations that if something happens at that camp, they've got a crisis line and a crisis team, that those people will be on the ground within 24 hours ready to go supporting that camp. And they'll be ready at a moment's notice digitally by providing conference calls, et cetera, on how to approach these things. Depending on how big your organization is, if you're part of a franchise, et cetera, a lot of those organizations will have those services available because it's in their best interest. If you are one of multiple locations under the same flag, it's going to negatively impact those other locations as well if something negative happens to your organization. So check in with that national group and see what exactly they offer as well. The last one that I'd say is looking at our plan interoperability. Basically, what this means is that with your organization, the plan is created in such a way that whenever other organizations plug into it, or say you've got a team from one of those national headquarters that's going to come in and work with your team, it makes it so that they know what's happening before they get on site. And there's no learning curve where I have to read through the plan to understand what you're doing. If you know that your national organization has some sort of a plan template, start with that. That way they know that you are on the same page as whatever national headquarters or support team is coming for you. Another thing we need to look at is considering form messages. So after we have completed our risk assessment and our THIRA, what we have is a list of things that can possibly happen. And typically there's one or two ways that those specific events can play out, but we still have a pretty limited list as far as what we can anticipate may be a harmful situation to our organization in the future. A form message simply is what you see on the screen here. It is a message that is pre-prepared with spots where you fill in the blank or things that you modify depending on the situation. That way you skip the step of developing a message from scratch. When we are trying to respond quickly in a matter of minutes, those minutes are critical. Every minute that you can save is another minute where you don't have to try and reel back whatever negative press is happening. The CDC provides some great guidance here, but there are an abundance of form messages out there that you can work with depending on what type of organization you're working with. Other things that are beneficial here are that, again, you're not relying on somebody with specific expertise to do this role. Something as simple as saying, the following event has happened in this area. You can have somebody, from the CEO to the local intern that can do that type of work and get it ready to go in pretty short order. And that way, that even if you are away from the organization as the potential crisis communicator, if you're out on vacation or if you've had the death of a loved one and you're at a funeral, this is still able to happen without you being there. This is something where you have the continuity of expertise ready to go at a moment's notice. So some other considerations that we want to account for. One, does our approach need to differ by platform, and how so? There are dozens of different social media platforms, and it's important to recognize the limitations and benefits of each. Facebook has a more long form notes where people are leaving the full press briefings and press releases, videos, etc. Twitter is limited by characters. Instagram is focused on videos and photos. Depending on what's going on with your organization, that may be a consideration that we're going to do all of our crisis communications through Twitter and Facebook, because we don't anticipate that happening on Instagram as much. Make that part of your plan and recognize what type of form messaging you need to have ready to go for those two platforms. Next up, do we know that we can execute this plan? This is one that a lot of times we fail to recognize, where we plan for something grandiose, but we don't recognize we have limitations in our existing capacity. If we have an all hands on deck situation and we don't have enough people that can do all the things we need, we have not done a good job in our planning. We want to make sure that we recognize our limitations, because we want to plan for reality. If we're not planning for reality, we're planning for failure. If I'm going to sit here and say, I know that I can run 3 marathons in one day, I can't do that. I know I can't do that, so I shouldn't plan on doing that. Otherwise, I'm just going to fail. Same thing for your organizations. If you know that this has been something that you have never pulled off before, then you probably don't want to plan for it. You want to plan for what you can actually do, and then try and make sure that you're trained up to it. And then, maybe in the future, you look at increasing the capacity of your organization. One question I get a lot is about consultants and hiring somebody to come into the business. We see the potential for a crisis communication situation to overwhelm us and to lead to greater losses than it would have cost to hire a private company to come in and address those needs. What I would say is that that is really a cost to benefit ratio for your organization, depending on if you are a multi-million-dollar company or a small local health clinic or whatever it might be. That's something that really only you can decide. The question that I typically steer people towards is, will an external person be able to understand the nuances of your organization? If you feel like your hospital or your large business is very similar to a lot of the other clients that crisis communications firm has worked for, that may be a good decision for your team. That may be something that you appreciate the expertise and the thoroughness that organization may be able to offer. At the same time, you've got to ask yourself, would it be better to train up somebody internally that knows our business, that is here on a day-to-day basis, and is somebody that's going to be able to customize that even further to really fit the needs of our local organization? Talk with your C team about that. Talk with the key stakeholders in all of your different departments of your organization, and see what is going to fit your needs best. All right, so taking a moment to look at addressing different approaches. One thing that we see a lot of times is basically there's 4 ways that individuals have handled things in the past. Again, we're not going to date the presentation by giving any specific examples. I'll talk about situations that tend to happen over and over again. And then we'll give you some examples that are in the past, just as kind of the punctuation points for what we're working with here. We see that overall, there's 4 general strategies for individuals when they're managing a crisis. So whenever that bad thing happens, they can either go through denial, diminishment, rebuilding, or potentially bolstering. And we'll talk about each one of those in detail. As a fictional case study to work with for the next few slides, we're going to do something that has happened over the last couple months in numerous locations, but we're not going to point out any specific hospitals or healthcare facilities in general. We're going to be respectful and make sure that we're just covering the content and covering how your organization can make sure we're ready to respond to it. So an employee of a local healthcare facility has been accused of deliberately destroying doses of COVID-19 vaccine. Reports state that the individual took 200+ doses and intentionally left them out of cold storage. The local healthcare facility has not responded to requests for interviews with local media. Again, this is something that's happened at different locations throughout the country. So we'll just use this as our canvas, if you will, for the next couple. So whenever we look at the approach of denial, simply stated, this is denying that something has happened. This is false. This did not happen. We know that this did not happen. A couple considerations that we need to look at. The first is making sure that we have no reason to believe that this event possibly occurred, and that we've done our due diligence in investigating that thing did not occur. The challenge here is that you can never prove a negative. And what we mean by that is you cannot say this did not happen. You can only say that so far I have not seen evidence that this did happen. And we want to make sure that we're framing it in that manner. Some negative outcomes that have happened whenever individuals have used this denial approach include getting proven wrong later on. We start by saying, no, this did not happen. This isn't something that's going on, only later to find out that we just hadn't dug deep enough. There's the words I'm looking for, to find out what exactly was going on. We hadn't talked to all of our individuals, or we had somebody that was withholding information because they were concerned about their job, et cetera. And so we need to make sure that we're recognizing that as a potential limitation. The next one is the impacts to our reputation. If we decide to go the initial route of, no, this isn't happening, oh wait, yes it is. That has a huge impact on our business because now we've lost the trust and reputation that we have within that local community. The last one is this has the potential to exacerbate negative outcomes compared to addressing it. If there is a problem and individuals are being harmed or property is being damaged, and we allow that event to go on, there's the potential that something bad can happen. So looking at our case study of this COVID vaccine being left out of cold storage, that may mean that there's negative effects on a patient, or that they simply aren't getting the immunity that they need because they didn't have a viable vaccine, et cetera. So those are things we want to address early on before those negative impacts happen. Some other examples besides the COVID vaccine would be looking at, there's a number of situations where a human or animal disease spread has occurred, and there's been a denial of it happening. So one that's a bit dated was looking at mad cow disease spread in Germany. They had a situation where a number of positive cases were found, but the agriculture minister denied that they were occurring. And very quickly, the spread continued and more people started to see that it was a problem. And then you had two problems on their hands. One is we still have mad cow disease in our country, and nobody trusts the agriculture minister anymore. The end result of that situation was they replaced the ag minister, and then they started on the warpath of how do we address this problem, which took a substantial amount of time to regain the public's trust as well as limit the spread of that disease. All right, next up is diminishment. And this is similar to our denial. Basically, in this situation, we are saying something did happen, but it's not as big a deal as people are making out to be. Nothing to worry about. Everything's managed here. And the prime example for that is the incidents that happened at Chernobyl. If you look at any documentaries, or if you're more of a historical fiction kind of situation, the HBO series Chernobyl does a real good job of covering it. But basically, we're looking at something being much bigger than we're letting on. Some considerations is, does this have the possibility of getting bigger? We're thinking that things are improving, but is it possible that they won't? Is it possible that this is starting to go down a worse path and we need to be ready for it? The other thing is, do we actively know that this is bigger than what we are letting on? That is a huge problem, especially within social media. Very quickly, organizations are called out whenever they are not letting on for bigger storylines that are occurring. Some of the negative outcomes, again, are that we're proven wrong. We have those negative impacts to our reputation. And in this situation, it's probably worse, the idea of exacerbating negative outcomes, because now we know that there's a problem, but we're saying it's not a big a deal, but it may be continuing to get worse and snowball from where we're looking at. Now, looking on what is probably some of the more successful approaches. The first two, unless you know that things are getting better, or with denial that you know that they actually didn't happen, any other use of those approaches probably is not going to end well for the organization. However, if we look at the last two options, these typically are much more successful for organizations to use. So whenever we look at rebuilding, it's the idea of, we know we have a problem, and we know it needs addressing. We want you to know how hard we're working on it. We're working to improve things. Here's the things that we are doing. This is acknowledging the issues that the public has cited, and it shows them what exactly is happening to fix those problems. That is a much more positive path than telling people not to worry about something. That also in the long run is going to build up a positive reputation, possibly improving what your reputation was compared to the pre-event level. Some considerations that we want to look at. Well, looking to our negative outcomes, one thing that's important to recognize is the potential for culpability related to lawsuits. One thing that I typically recommend on this one especially is that while on a human level, we know that it's the best approach to be honest and open with those individuals. Sometimes we want to make sure that we're talking to our legal counsel beforehand to make sure that that is going along the lines of what the organization has as best practices. Sometimes you want to handle things privately with an individual. Sometimes there's other approaches that the organization typically takes. Not necessarily that you're looking to get out of any negative circumstances, but you do want to make sure that you're going with the best practices of your organization. A good example of agencies that are using this rebuilding approach would be oil companies following large events. You can see during most Super Bowls, during most big media events, that some of those oil companies will show some of those commercials to show people what they are doing to improve conditions caused by some of those negative events. Last one that can be used on a day-to-day basis, even if there is not an event that you're responding to, is the approach of bolstering. So we're working hard to make the experience safer. Even though nothing has happened, our agency is working to improve conditions for you, to improve conditions for our clients, to make our communities better. Here is what we're doing. Some considerations that we're looking at, again, we're trying to move the needle towards a more positive press following specific actions. But also we're looking at the need to be sincere with these things, both for bolstering as well as for our last slide. We want to make sure that the actions that we're taking are sincere. We're not just throwing a bone to individuals because we think it's going to increase our worth in the public. If we're doing something insincere, we're probably going to get called out for it. You know, if we if you're a fan of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, if you're the boss and you give out the Jelly of the Month Club versus the usual Christmas bonus and you get called out for it, you want to make sure you're giving sincere actions and not just something that's meant to distract while you wait for things to cool down. Be sincere with those actions and be sincere with the coverage of those actions. If it is an insincere activity, or if it really doesn't have that big of an effect, the public is likely to call you out for that, and that may lead to a further incident that you're needing to respond to. So we're getting towards the end of our session. I wanted to provide a couple final notes. So first off, Crisis communications has the potential to be a double-edged sword. Whenever you engage with the public, there kind of is a point of diminishing returns where if things are bad and things continue to get worse, there is that line in the sand where you say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to improve this situation. We need to let this thing ride out. That being said, you need to work with your organization to identify where exactly those boundaries are. What things do we want to address? What things do we know that we can successfully address as part of our efforts? And what things do we acknowledge are not going to happen? If you're an airline company, there are a number of topics that you just don't cover. You don't look at the delays that are happening. You don't look at some of those low-level problems that customers have, simply because there are too many critiques of those businesses for them to successfully manage each one of them. That's just something that is likely part of their business model where they know we can't solve everybody's problems. So the following topics over here, we're going to take off the table. These ones over here are the ones that we're going to look at. We're going to look at why people get kicked off planes and making sure that we've done the right thing here. These make news media and this impacts our stock. Somebody getting delayed from their flight from Kansas City to Philadelphia is not going to impact our stock. Things that you want to look at and cover with your organization. Lastly, other additional resources that we are going to be providing. Again, this was provided through the chat here, as well as this will be emailed after the fact. But we've got some resource sheets from some of our other sessions that include that relevant material. And then, of course, just like I mentioned earlier, check out those trainings from Missouri SEMA, State Emergency Management Agency, as well as the Emergency Management Institute. For those of you that are working in hospital and healthcare work, I'd also recommend the Center for Domestic Preparedness, which is down in Fort McClellan, Alabama. You can go there, and those are very specific to healthcare related trainings. All of those, there are very minor expenses included with that. And so you can go down there and attend those sessions as part of those FEMA trainings. Last thing that I would say is that if you are interested in learning more about some of this content, or you're interested in possibly taking on an intern, we have both emergency management interns as well as communications interns that need summer experiences. This summer we're getting kind of close to the start, so most of them have their internships lined up. But there's always the potential that we have a couple that need experiences, or you can jump on the list for the next summer. Please feel free to reach out to myself, and depending on your needs, I can connect up with our crisis communications instructor here on campus, or connect you with one of my students personally. Lastly, here is my email. If there is anything that I can do to support your agencies, one of our efforts with the Emergency and Disaster Management Program is supporting our local partners. I'm a citizen of Northwest Missouri, just like all of you are, and I want to make sure that I am helping all the agencies that are protecting my family and my loved ones. If there's anything that I can do to support you or your agency, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to give you any information that I have and see how we can support your organization. Otherwise, again, I thank you for attending this session, and I hope it was beneficial to you.
Thank you, John Carr, for your presentation today and your partnership. Are there any questions for Mr. Carr?
Everyone should be able to unmute themselves, so feel free to do that and ask away.
And if there is anything, again, please feel free to email me and I can contact you directly.
Thank you, John.
Thank you all. I hope you have a good night.
Well, thank you to those who attended today's webinar. As a reminder, a copy of the slides from the presentation along with the post-webinar survey will be sent out to you via email. And a recording of today's webinar will be posted on the Northwest Missouri Regional Council of Governments Facebook page and YouTube channel in the near future. And please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again for your attendance.